Hey, everybody, this is Sammy Obeid, and today we will be talking about the economic impacts of lockdown. So, accordingly, I'm joining you from a room where I spent most of my lockdown here in this storage space. I've decorated it accordingly to really feel the effects of a pandemic on a human.
Yeah, and those socks over there, I can see.
You can see socks, wires, everything. I really went full on for this role. I even put the ironing board there so you could really feel it. So,
Yeah, it's good.
today we are joined by the amazing Flavio Toxvaerd.
Yeah, that's
Toxvaerd.
good. Yeah, hi.
And you are Danish Argentinian. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Those are
Well,
those are
that's the simple version.
those are neighboring countries. Is that so?
Absolutely. Yeah, with Ukraine just in the middle.
That's good to know. So, are you from originally from Argentina or family?
Well, actually, well, yeah, Argentinian mother, Danish father.
Wow, wow.
Yeah. So
I,
I've lived and grown up in both countries.
that's great. That's good. That's a very um, unique background, and fittingly would explain why you're an economic epidemiologist, which are seemingly two very foreign subjects that you
That's
have
right.
somehow bridged the gap.
Until very recently, when people asked me, what do you do? And I said economic epidemiology, people always thought I was talking about epistemology because they couldn't fathom that somebody working in economics was interested in epidemiology.
So technically, you are an economic epidemiologist, right?
Well,
Or is or an epidemiological economist?
right. So this is a title I had to come up with because people in media asked me, how do we refer to you? And that title is a made up title like all other titles, but it's meant to convey that it's a person who studies economics and infectious diseases, but I'm not an economist who just looks at the fallout on the economy of the epidemic.
Mm,
So economic epidemiologists are distinguished from those types of economists by actually going the other way and using economic ideas and tools to inform disease management policies.
I see. And you have you been fascinated with epidemiology since you started economics, or did that kind of just come
So,
over time?
so no, actually, I had already left graduate school when I started becoming interested in these issues. I originally picked up a mathematical epidemiology textbook to learn more about how ideas and rumors and jokes spread in populations. And I thought there was some nice work to be done there. I mean, economists, of course, are interested in these kind of things because stock market movements and so forth could depend on how information spreads in populations. And so that was my impetus for studying epidemiology in the first place. But then, in some sense, I got quote unquote sidetracked, and rather than taking epidemiology as a metaphor for a spread of ideas and rumors, I actually took it seriously and started thinking about how can I use my tools from economics to understand the spread of diseases. And so it just so happened that I had specialized in a set of tools from economics, dynamic game theory and dynamic optimization tools like optimal control theory, basically branches of applied operations research or mathematics.
Right.
And those just seem to be very well suited for the analysis of that kind of models.
I actually love all of the trades. Economics, epidemiology, e-commerce. Those are all my favorites. So
Wonderful.
yeah.
E-cigarettes.
E-cigarettes too. Even though I don't recommend them, I'm sure you probably don't either. But I'm sure we have some viewers who are smoking them right now. Hey, it's a lockdown. So where are you joining us from, Flavio?
I'm in New York at the moment, visiting from on sabbatical leave.
Great. And where do you normally stay?
So usually I'm at Cambridge, United Kingdom, the old Cambridge, as it were.
The old Cambridge. What is there? There's a new Cambridge. I'm
Oh,
sorry.
Cambridge, Massachusetts.
Oh, okay. That's the new Cambridge. All right.
I'm sure there's a smattering of other Cambridges around the world, but that's the one that came to mind. Yeah.
The USA likes to do everything new. New Mexico, New York, New
Yeah, you
Cambridge.
have
So
it.
now that you're in the USA, you're new Flavio.
Ah, ah. I'm the kind of person who never feels fully at home anywhere, but then also feels kind of at home everywhere.
That's great. You must be very well versed across the whole world then. Well, thank you so much for joining us. You have such an interesting backstory, and you've covered a lot of relevant topics in the recent years. But before we begin, maybe just you want to tell us about what you do and.
So I'm an economist by training. I did all my degrees in economics, and now I'm a researcher. I'm an academic researcher in economics, and I've been spending a good part of my career working on interdisciplinary topics, in particular in the space between infection control or epidemiology and microeconomics. So it's kind of an interdisciplinary field of study that has become particularly relevant over the last 2 years, but was actually relevant even before then, just in parts of the world that didn't get as much attention as our neck of the woods.
So as soon as you started talking more about the rest of the world, people were listening more. Is that what you're saying?
Well, people are interested in things that are close to home, and until very recently, infectious diseases was something that was like relegated to less developed countries, and unless you had a specific interest in those countries or you were a development economist, you were maybe not likely to pay much attention. But of course, once COVID hit the Western world, everybody suddenly paid attention to these issues, and so you don't worry much about volcanoes when they're on the other side of the world. If it's in your backyard, suddenly that concentrates your mind.
Well, I worry about volcanoes every day of my life, even though I've never seen one. But
Yeah,
I'm a different kind of guy. Uh,
yeah. You
so,
should
so
probably rein that back a bit. Otherwise, you won't get through
right.
the afternoon.
I'm going to therapy for my volcano obsession, actually. Speaking of volcanoes, the pandemic was, in a way, sort of an eruption of all sorts of things that had been buried underneath our society for a long time. What have we learned from the pandemic that we didn't know before?
Well, I mean, so one of the obvious things is that our preparedness to deal with these kind of issues clearly was not up to scratch.
Hmm.
This is, I think, that's an uncontroversial statement, and also probably that there've been underinvestment in dealing with situations like that, not just in terms of infrastructure, testing capabilities, and so forth, but also scientifically and policy-wise. I think there's been quite egregious errors made that were avoidable had we kind of learned the lessons of previous pandemics. And I am hoping, of course, that this time will be different, and that we will make a concerted effort to draw lessons going forward. But I think there's a general recognition that infectious disease is something we have to take seriously, also as economists. And there are things we can contribute to it that we are only trying to do right now. I have, of course, academic papers that have made some impact in the academic literature, but I'd hesitate to say that those were of widespread interest or attention. I'm hoping that they will pay.
They
So
spread widely enough for you to get on this podcast, so
that's
that's a
true.
good sign. Yeah.
So one of my early academic contributions has been to focus explicitly on behavior and how behavior changes the equation during pandemics. So the volcano is a nice example that explains really where the economics comes in when looking at infectious diseases. So when the volcano erupts, in some sense, we as humans and as policymakers, we just respond to what the volcano does. But there's little sense in which our behavior changes the evolution of the volcanic eruption.
You love the volcano analogy, don't you?
Absolutely, that's the right takeaway point.
So let's ask more specifically. I know you wrote some pieces about the economic impacts of lockdowns and kind of the trade-off between lockdown, no lockdown. In essence, what do you think we've learned in terms of lockdowns and the economics of them that we should say, I guess, like you said, make different choices moving forward?
So let me be a bit tongue in cheek. Some of these lessons were kind of already learned by some people before the pandemic, but the people who may actually make decisions might have only learned it too late.
Hmm.
So the first one is that idea of trade-offs. That there are trade-offs everywhere. In some sense, trade-offs are the defining feature of economics. But Yet many economists have kind of balked at the idea that the situation we were facing was just a simple one of livelihoods versus lives. That in some sense we had to trade off. We had to figure out, how many dead people are we willing to tolerate, and how much damage to the economy are we willing to tolerate. And while economists have certainly recognized that there are trade-offs, we also insist that the trade-offs are much more complicated. So, for example, many people, especially business lobby groups and their political backers, have often set it up as, you're destroying business with these lockdowns, and therefore you should hold back on lockdowns, because otherwise they're going to have all this economic damage. And a slightly more even-headed analysis will show that most of the damage caused by the pandemic is actually through voluntary behavioral change rather than policy intervention. So if I can just unpack that a little bit, suppose you're in a world where there's no policy intervention whatsoever, and the disease has started spreading in the population. Well, people, they have a self-interest in trying to protect themselves and their loved ones. And so they will naturally change behavior. They will stop going to the cinema as much as they usually would. They would stop going to public transport and so forth. So even if there's no intervention, people will actually change behavior, and that will have adverse economic consequences. Now, what we also know is that left to their own devices, people are not necessarily going to do enough, simply for the fact that, I know that I could get infected if I expose myself, and I might care about my immediate family and, my daughters and my wife and so forth. But I might not factor in that they might meet you in the cinema, and then you might infect your cousin and so forth. And so whenever there's this kind of discrepancy between private incentives or personal incentives and global social incentives, then there will be a role, at least for coordination, from the perspective of policymaker. And so what that means is that while it is true that when you introduce restrictions on people's behavior and mobility and so on, is going to cause some damage, we err when we think that all the damage is caused by policy, because really what we should be doing is we should be attributing just the level of damage that is over and above that which is caused by voluntary behavior change.
So you're saying that people are the problem?
What I'm saying is that the disease is the problem. The
Sure.
policy response, if it's correctly designed, actually is one way out of the problem.
Sure. But you're saying if people were maybe just a little bit smarter and thought more carefully about some of the choices that we made, that we might actually be better off.
This is a universally true statement. If people were more benevolent and clever, we might be better off.
Right.
That's not quite what I was saying, because in some sense, even if people are perfectly rational, just because they're small, in the sense that my individual behavior has a negligible effect on the aggregate evolution of the disease. So even if I had all the best intentions in the world, I can do very little on my own in order to change outcomes. And that's where policymakers can help step in and coordinate actions in situations that otherwise would be very difficult to get better outcomes.
You have become quite popular for speaking out on these economic issues regarding the pandemic and the lockdown. Would you, if somebody in the United States called you the Dr. Fauci of economics, would you find that flattering or insulting?
That's good. So I don't want to compare myself to him just because of his enormous stature. And not physical stature, of course, but
he's a big guy. He's a big guy. Yeah.
He is one of the leading experts globally in public health. But I would certainly take it as a compliment. I do believe that Fauci and the health authorities in the United States have made errors, but I think that given the constraints that he faced, I think he's done an excellent job.
What are your thoughts on masking at this point? Do you think that we should just completely lift it? Do you think that we should or just do one or the other and stick to it?
So look, I think there's no denying that we are in a substantially different place now than we were at the early stages of the pandemic.
No,
Omicron,
I'm actually still at my parents' house. So
yeah, but that's for cultural reasons, right?
okay, yeah, true.
so so yeah, no, I was trying to say is that the world looks very different now than it does, at least in our part of the world, than it did during the early stages of the pandemic. I think the urgency for mask wearing is certainly diminished, just because the severity of the Omicron strain is just much lower, or somewhat lower than it was early on. So if I may, maybe I would distinguish between early in the pandemic versus now. I think one of the issues that was very complicated is that the messaging from people that supposedly knew these things was very confused at the early stages. So there were authorities saying, no, we should not wear masks. However, it could cause more damage than it could help, right? So early on, there was not a recommendation that people wear masks, and there were scientific reasons given for that. I remember Danish authorities. I was born in Copenhagen, so I pay a bit of attention to what they were doing there. And I remember experts saying, no, actually, when people wear masks, they tend to fidget with them and adjust them, and that actually could help create more infection and so forth, right? So early on, and again, I emphasize, I'm not a virologist or an epidemiologist. My impression was really that masks were perhaps not such a great idea. It turned out later that no, masks actually, while not perfectly efficient, they do have a useful role to play at relatively low cost. And so, because the public authorities dithered at the early stages and they gave a muddled message, that actually allowed people who were dead set against masks for whatever reasons, ideological or political, to actually hang their hat on this discrepancy between early and later advice and say, look, we can't trust these authorities because, look, first they said this, then suddenly they said something else. So do I believe that mask mandate should be lifted? I personally, and here I'm talking as myself personally, I find masks to be a relatively minor inconvenience. I understand that some people feel very strongly about it. I don't think it's a great imposition on my personal liberties to ask me to wear a mask. And so I personally wear a mask wherever I go now, indoors, not outdoors, but even in spaces where I'm yet not required to do so. And I would be happy if other people did the same. Now, does that necessarily mean I would force that upon people? Not necessarily. I think there's a greater weighing off between different considerations that needs to be taken there. How bad is the situation? Is it something that really makes a difference at this point in the epidemic? These are difficult questions, and I don't know quite what the answer is to that.
Okay. Good. But regarding the other the lifting of like all the other mandates that happened in the UK, do you think that was the right thing to do?
As the epidemic becomes less severe, it's inevitable we're going to lift restrictions or at least ease restrictions. So I don't quibble with that. I'm not one of those people who thinks that we permanently have to live in a lockdown society whenever there are some people that are infected. Now, having said that, my suspicion is that the time frame, or rather the timetable of the easing of restrictions has not been driven by a careful consideration of the health benefits or the economic benefits of different policy measures. It seems to have been driven more by a desire to placate those people who are ideologically opposed to these mandates. So I think there has been political expedience to lifting those restrictions now, and that might have overridden other considerations.
So you think it probably wasn't the best idea? Is that what you're saying?
I could easily see a good. I sound like, I know I sound like a politician now because I'm not being very clear. But one of the things I've learned is that there are always trade-offs. There are trade-offs. And one of my main complaints, and I've said this to anyone who wanted to listen, is that in order to give definite answers about any of these things, we need to have a credible cost-benefit analysis. And that has never been actually produced by anyone that I know of. Okay, so if you have the numbers, then it's much more easy to say, we've actually looked at this as an integrated, holistic problem. These are the pros and cons, these are the numbers, and that's why we do what we do. When people say to you, when people don't show their work, they just say, oh, on balance, this is the right thing to do. It's very difficult to say that it isn't so unless you know exactly what they base those decisions on. So, I think one can easily make a good case that, maintaining some restrictions going forward would have made sense. So, for example, masking on public transport. That is something which I emphasize, this is my personal opinion, is a low-cost thing to do. But symbolically, it seems to be very powerful, and people really wanted to get rid of this measure, even if we know that it might actually have benefited us all.
Interesting. So I know you also wrote a piece on how do vaccines affects the risks we face in our behavior. What were the main findings you were trying to convey in that piece?
Well, the first thing to note is that, vaccines in some sense is an alternative to social distancing, right? You vaccinate yourself, that does three things to you. First of all, it may reduce the probability that you become infected in the first place. That's kind of what people have in mind when they think of vaccines, but that's just one of the possible effects. That may or may not happen depending on the disease and depending on the vaccine. Early on, indications were that with the Delta and so forth, that vaccines did reduce infection probabilities, although not as much as one would have liked, but it did have that effect. The second effect is that it may also reduce onward transmission. So that means even if you get infected, if you're vaccinated, you clear the infection quicker, and that means you are less of a risk to third parties. And the last one, which is probably the major one for the kind of vaccines we have now, is that reduces the probability of severe illness, hospitalization, and death. Okay. Now, all those things, they contribute to change the risk-benefit calculation that people make. And so just to give you an extreme, suppose I could take a vaccine and completely cut off all infection risk. That's what's called sterilizing immunity. So that's kind of a unicorn that if we could have it, of course we would take it, right? Now, if I could take that kind of effective vaccine, that means basically that I wouldn't have to change my behavior at all. I could go back to doing all the nice things that I used to do and basically forget about the disease, right? Because I'm safe. To the extent that the vaccine provides imperfect protection, that allows us more or less relaxing, putting down our guard in other respects, right? And so when you roll out a vaccine in the population, it's going to change the behavior of people. And in some sense, it shouldn't be surprising, right? I mean, if it didn't change our behavior, why would we want to change? Why would we want to vaccinate people, right? We want to vaccinate people so we can get back to life. So we want to get back to the things that we like to do, right? So vaccines can condition behavior, but also it could have unintended consequences. It could backfire. And so let me try to kind of paint a picture for you. You get vaccinated, you are not perfectly protected. You are somewhat protected, but not perfectly so. What that could mean is that you could actually, if you overestimate the efficiency of the vaccine, it could actually prompt you to unnecessarily expose yourself to infection. And so, whereas it is true that the vaccine reduces your risks for a number of contacts, you could also be enticed to have more contacts than you otherwise would have. And so there's a kind of a give and take. Yes, you are more protected, but also it changes your underlying behavior in the direction of taking more risks. So my co-author always, likes to point out that, you might think that on the highway, lots of people should die, lots of pedestrians should die by oncoming vehicles because they go so fast. And yet we don't see so much of that. Why? Because people know it's dangerous to walk around on highways. So they don't do that so much. Okay. So just looking at the danger on its own without actually factoring in how that might change behavior actually can be misleading. And this is also true in the context of vaccines.
Interesting. The highway analogy, very, very interesting. Yeah, I think also the problem is there's not crosswalks on the highway too, so that definitely helps.
That doesn't help. That doesn't
Yeah,
help.
yeah, yeah. So interesting. Yeah, yeah. I mean, this makes sense because I think a lot of people, when they heard 94% efficacy on the vaccine, they just round up to 100, and then they make 100 new friends. So it sounds like really the winners of this pandemic are people who don't have a lot of friends.
That is absolutely true. Yeah, and other winners are the people who knew how to homeschool before it became modern.
Right, 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 right. Exactly. So going back to some of your economic findings, what are some of the most counterintuitive findings in the recent work of economic epidemiology?
Well, the one I've just mentioned now, which is the policies can backfire, is certainly amongst the top most counterintuitive things, right?
Yeah.
Exactly because behavior can change. There was a study, I forget, I think it was in Israel, where they found that people who had just been vaccinated suddenly had a spike in infections. And a naive reading of this would be, well, they got infected because of the vaccine. Well, it turns out that those people actually didn't realize that the immunity only sets in after a little while.
Right.
Right. So you're not protected immediately. After you get vaccinated, your body needs time to respond. And yet those people didn't realize that, and therefore just went out and about their daily lives as if they were fully protected. All right. And so this is just a very stark illustration of this principle. Other than that, I mean, this idea, by the way, is called the disinhibition. It basically, it basically lets you put down your guards. And there's a long history of this in economics, going way back to the 1970s, I believe, where Peltzman of University of Chicago noted something like this in the context of seatbelts. He said basically, when people wear seatbelts, they're going to be less careful, and so they might actually cause more accidents than otherwise. So, but I don't know. I haven't kind of set my mind to looking specifically for counterintuitive results, right?
Understood. Understood. I do like the word disinhibition because they say, for instance, when you have a few drinks, it lowers your inhibition. So people ever see me drinking and they ask why, I just said, well, just disinhibitioning.
Disinhibition, right?
Yeah, yeah. So
you might want to couple that with another concept, which
yeah,
is immiserization.
immiserization. Yeah.
Yeah, which is you get something good and actually turn out to be worse for it.
What would you say is an example of that in the pandemic?
Well, exactly that
Yeah.
because of disinhibition,
Yeah.
everybody could be worse off, even though the measure that you introduced and ostensibly was a good one.
Right. So going back to the car analogy, the safest approach is to wear a seatbelt even when not driving.
Absolutely.
So let me ask you, what are the biggest disagreements among economists in this regard, this topic?
In general, when there's complete unanimity, you should become skeptical, right? And I wouldn't say that there's been complete unanimity within the economics profession, but by and large, there's been a surprising amount of agreement. First of all, there's somewhat of a misconception about economists and what are their objectives in life. Economists are thought by many to be people who are for the economy, quote unquote, or something like that, right? And we are not, we are people who study the economy, right? We're not people here who are here to advocate the economy, and so many people just assume that economists would be would be reluctant to put in place public health measures in order to save the economy. That hasn't been the case. Most economists have come to the conclusion that one of the best ways to make the economy flourish is to get the pandemic under control. And so there's not necessarily a schism between many of the policies that have been advocated by public health officials and the ones that economists would think were appropriate.
So you're saying economists tend to, I mean, just I guess in general, or in this specific case, seem to agree on a lot of things. It's almost like if civilians and people in the health industry and politicians could all be more like economists, that we might be better off. Is that what you're saying?
I absolutely invite everyone to join us. Everyone. So, I mean, think of it this way. I mean, what do we learn as undergraduate economists? What we learn is, well, how can we make this a better place for us? Okay, we don't learn that what are the policies that will maximize economic growth. No, economic growth is only useful to the extent that it makes people's lives better. Okay, so it just so happens that some aspects of our lives have nothing to do with economic growth, has to do with physical well-being. Okay, so as an economist, it's not a strange thought that you want to make policies that make us happy in whatever way possible. It could be because we have better health. It could be because we have better material standards of living and so forth. So, as far as I'm concerned, health is just one of the many aspects of life that make a life worth living. And so as economists, we should support policies that improve our health. So, yeah.
What's more important, health or money?
Well, for you or for me?
I guess, yeah, for me, yeah, for what the...
Look, without health, money is not worth much, is it? I mean, this is, of course...
with enough money, you can buy health, can't you?
No, not always. It is true that with money you have improved health, but there are some things you can't buy your way out of. There are actually serious researchers looking at what is your valuation of wealth when your health changes. So I have not contributed to that, but people are actually looking at these kind of questions. Yeah.
So yeah, so health versus wealth. If you have both health and wealth and stealth, I think we've got a good combination there.
That's the holy trinity.
Health, wealth, and stealth. Yeah. So
that's right.
So
you want to be a wealthy, healthy ninja.
Yes, exactly. That's a direct quote that I'm gonna cite you on. Yeah, and I know you recently had an interview with, was it the Financial Times, about where you said if economists and epidemiologists communicated more, we might be better off.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. So one of the most prominent epidemiologists over the last 2 years, Ferguson of Imperial College London, who was lead author of this famous study that basically jolted politicians into many of these lockdown measures. He had a paper about 10 years ago. I forget whether it was Nature or Science, saying one of the central things that we need to fully understand to make progress in epidemiology is to incorporate behavior. He said it very explicitly, and he invited people. Notably, he did not invite economists, maybe because he didn't know that we were interested in these things. He invited other scientific disciplines to join this effort. It just so happens that economists have taken him up on this invitation and have started doing the research. Yeah. So yes, economists can certainly contribute, but there's also a fear that economists talk to themselves rather than about these issues, rather than to the epidemiologists. So I keep striving for more and more conversation. I have initiated a number of workshops and conferences and other collaborative projects between epidemiologists, public health people, and economists. And I'm happy to report that things are actually moving in the right direction. And so it's not an easy project, but I think it's one worthwhile engaging in. So, so yeah, I mean, if you find a subject of science that economists haven't contributed to, then it's just because it hasn't happened yet, right? Uh,
Right. Right.
Epidemiology is just the last iteration on that.
So let's say every epidemiologist in the world was listening to you right now,
Right.
and you had 30 seconds to tell them what you think they should know. What would you tell them?
He says, "We're not your enemy. Come to us." Look, on a more serious note, few fields, few fields welcome outsiders in, and some people can view it as a confrontation or as an implicit criticism when other people come and tell you how to do things. And I would urge epidemiologists not to think about economists in that way. In some sense, epidemiology is the quintessentially interdisciplinary field of inquiry. You have mathematicians, network theorists, public health people, medical scientists. All those people come from different disciplines and find a home in epidemiology. For some reason or other, economists haven't joined that family or that conversation yet, and they're now starting to do so. So I would just say, listen to us and teach us, because we also have things to learn, of course. So to this is very long-winded and roundabout way of saying, this is an invitation to continue this conversation.
Do you think going forward there will be more people like yourself, economic epidemiologists?
It's hard to say. What is true is that this has been a little bit of an eye opener. I think most economists worth their salt have been thinking about one model or other or research project over the last few years that has been somehow related to epidemiology. Now, I have no illusions that all those people will keep being research active in this field. Who knows? Maybe today, we have the bad news about the invasion of Ukraine. Maybe security issues become more important and people switch attention to other issues.
Right.
This is completely natural, but given that people have now whetted their appetite and tried to think about some of these issues, I'm sure there's going to be more interest in the field than there was in the past. But again, I don't have illusions that it's going to be as strong as it has been over the last few years.
So, similar question. If we had every politician, policymaker right here on this Zoom right now, and they were all listening to you, and you had 30 seconds to let them know what you think they should do to move us forward out of this pandemic in the best way possible, what would you say? Pressure's
Yeah,
on.
pressure's on. Yeah, that's right. I have little illusion that what I say will change, our way out of the pandemic now. I think we will be modeling through more or less conditioned by what our experience has been so far. What I would say is that uh, I would urge policymakers to make this a learning experience and and realize that really we could have done much better. And next time we must do much better, because as epidemiologists have said, as bad as this has been, it could have been much worse. I mean, I invite you to speculate what would have happened if the pandemic hit primarily the young rather than the old,
Mm-hmm.
right? Then suddenly it becomes an issue of existential risk. And this is not completely unlikely, right? This could happen. Now, what are the circumstances under which this would happen? I'm not trained or educated enough on epidemiology to understand exactly what that will take. But there certainly is a possibility, right? So I think as bad as this has been, and it has been cataclysmic, we should think of it as a near miss for us as a species, and really concentrate on how to do things better going forward. That means, having proper scientific analyses of these issues, try to have proper holistic interdisciplinary analyses, have proper preparedness and investment in infrastructure, so that if we were to face a situation like this again, we already know, how do we roll out mass testing? How do we roll out mass vaccination? How do we best do restrictions if they become necessary? So, for example, early on in the pandemic, we had very, very coarse policy options at our disposal. We basically closed down everything. Well, maybe with a little bit of more analysis, we learned that some sectors of the economy are better to close down than others. What have we learned about school transmission? Would we close down schools next time, or maybe not, and so forth? So there are certainly lessons to be learned, and so my call would be, let's make sure that these lessons are indeed learned.
So if right now, if Boris Johnson asked you to be his economic advisor,
Yeah.
but the caveat is you have to attend every party that he goes to, and you'll get pictures taken of you on camera at the party.
Yeah, I think
Are
I'll
you?
skip. I think I'll give it a miss.
um,
Yeah. No, I think in that case, I'd rather be giving the advice on the sideline.
okay, okay, good to know. Good to know. Uh, so I get the last question I want to ask is, what do you think the most interesting thing we've discovered out of this whole pandemic, and human behavior, or just a general observation of humanity? What do you think the most interesting takeaway is?
From a scientific perspective, this has been an exhilarating ride. I mean, this is my research area, and you can't help to look at this with a kind of a morbid fascination, because it is certainly terrible. And many people have lost their lives and their livelihoods, and I certainly do not want to diminish that in any way. Having said that, it has also been very interesting as an object of analysis, especially in my professional capacity as somebody who studied these issues. Now, things that have surprised me the most have maybe not been so much to do with my own work, but more about social and political issues to do with the pandemic. How the pandemic and the responses to the pandemic had really torn at the fabric of our society. If you had asked me before the pandemic, would people get together and show solidarity and all work in the same direction? I would say, more likely than not. People have often used the war analogy about how people really, band together in times of crisis, and that has not been the case.
That is interesting, because in a sense the pandemic was kind of like a time of war, but the war was in a sense with ourselves.
Yeah,
As we
right.
are humans are the host of the virus, so it's hard to fight yourself. So it seems like if society had a more if society was more unified, if everybody had a more unified approach to this whole pandemic, we would have been better off in so many ways. And you suggested that in times of war that does tend to happen, and of course we wouldn't want an actual war to happen, but what if we staged a war with aliens so that all humans could come together? Then maybe we would have a unified response.
Yeah, but as long as it's the right aliens, not the aliens
Mm.
we don't like so much.
I see. I see. So with aliens that we could eventually become friends with
Yeah,
might be the way out of
aliens
this.
like us, not aliens like them.
I see. I see. Well,
Yeah.
thank you so much. This has all been very enlightening. Anywhere, that we can find you, any further reading that you would suggest for people to look into?
So look, I'm active on Twitter at the handle at Toxvaerd1. So that's my surname and the number one. I have a dedicated page where I put all my research and my policy writing. So there's a link in my Twitter profile, or you can just Google my name and then I'll come up. And there I have a whole bunch of resources on all aspects of this little corner of the universe that has to do with economics and epidemiology. So there's lots of stuff to get on with there.
Well, so that's about it. Thank you so much for doing this. Sorry we did go a little over time. It was just so
No,
much
no, it's
interesting stuff.
wonderful.
Yeah, yeah,
It's been good fun.
yeah. Well, awesome. I hope we can meet sometime in the
Yeah,
real
my
life.
pleasure.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Awesome.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank
Take
you,
care,
Flavio.
Sammy.
Yeah. Take care as well. Talk to you later.
Bye.
All right. Bye.